And a warm welcome to those who've just joined us here. For those of you who haven't been part of the earlier part of the proceedings, I'll reintroduce myself. I'm Councillor John Cotton from Birmingham, and I'm the chair of Labour Housing Group. And we're here for a really important event, the launch of Housing as a Human Right, a joint report between Labour Housing Group and the Labour Campaign for Human Rights. Setting out how we're going to turn the commitment to making housing a human right a reality for people in this country. It's a excellent production that comprises 16 new essays by housing and human rights academics and practitioners, explain the position of housing in international human rights law, how these laws could be applied across all areas of housing policy in the UK, and what the legal and the practical implications are. As you know, the party adopted at conference last year a composite resolution that included a commitment to Labour establishing housing as a human right in the UK. So a very important campaign that we've been working on with our colleagues at the Labour Campaign for Human Rights, and really recommend that you take some time to read this report, which sets out the case for action. We're going to hear from 4 speakers talking about issues and themes around housing as a human right and the practicalities of putting this into action. And so I'm going to take them all in turn, and then there'll be time for a bit of a Q&A at the end. So if I could introduce our first speaker, Steve Cockburn from the Labour Campaign for Human Rights, who of course are our partners in this campaign to get housing as a human right written into party policy. And Steve also works for Amnesty and has a long track record of campaigning for housing, health and workers' rights, both here and right across the globe, including 8 years leading Amnesty's work in West Africa. So really grateful to have Steve here this morning. And without any further ado, I will hand over to Steve. Steve.
Brilliant. Thanks. Hi, everyone. And really good to see so many people here. And I just looked through the names. Great to see so many of the people who contributed to this report on the call as well. So that's really great. I just wanted to say a few words, I guess, to start to explain a little bit about why Labour Campaign for Human Rights decided to embark on this and to work with Labour Housing Group, and why we think it's so important, but also exciting as well. And first of all, I really want to thank everyone who contributed to it. It's a really great collection of essays. I think it's bigger and better than I originally thought it was going to be when we first started the project, and that's thanks to the caliber of the people who've contributed. So just as a little bit of background, Labour Campaign for Human Rights, we've been campaigning for about nearly 3 years now as part of our work to try and get the Labour Party to commit to enshrining a full range of economic and social rights into law. So the rights to health, housing, food, social security, many of the human rights, the fundamental human rights recognized in international law that are not covered by the Human Rights Act or are not covered by other domestic legislation, and are big gaps in our human rights law. We've got this broad call to have all of these rights enshrined in law, which is our overall aim. But over the last couple of years, we've also been trying to focus on a couple of specific issues where we can see there's a real urgency, but also see where there is an opportunity and some momentum. So we did some work on, and we continue to do some work on the right to food. And you'll have seen the campaign that Ian Byrne and others have been driving on that issue, and that made it into the last manifesto. And of course, we've been focusing with you all on the right to housing more recently. Because for the obvious reasons of the homelessness and housing crisis there is, but also because there has been recognition at the very top of the party, whether that is from Keir Starmer, whether it's from Jeremy Corbyn before, from Andy Burnham, and from a succession of different shadow housing ministers, that Labour should be committed to putting human rights at the heart of our housing policy. And we all know, and I think this is the reason that the right to housing is fundamental as a human right to a whole range of other rights, whether it's health, whether it's the right to family life. And that's why I think that gets such support and why it's so fundamental. What we've seen probably less on is what that actually really means in practice. What does it really mean? What difference does that mean for government policy? What does that mean for the way that we develop our laws, our strategies, and our policies? And so we want to make sure that it's not just rhetoric, but it actually changes the way that we approach the issue. And so we thought a good idea would be to invite people who really know about housing, which is you, to share your ideas and proposals, and to try and put that into a human rights framework and to take forward as a basis for discussion. And I think what's come out is a really, really good starting point for that discussion. And I'll finish by just saying why I particularly think the human rights angle is important for the housing policy. I think first of all, it changes our discussions on homelessness, unsafe housing, unaffordable housing from being failures of a social policy to being violations of fundamental human rights, and there with corresponding obligations for the state to do something about it. It shouldn't be a choice. There are choices about how you go about it, but it shouldn't be a choice about whether you do something about it. It provides a framework for identifying and tackling key issues, many of which are identified in the report, whether that's affordability, security of tenure, housing safety, decency of homes, and many other. It forces us, I think, as well, to look at some of the inequalities in housing access, whether that is relate to people with disabilities, about ethnic minorities, women, or traveller communities. It kind of forces us to confront those inequalities that sometimes can get brushed over. And it also brings some important human rights principles that apply right across many human rights standards around accountability, legal remedies, and the participation of people to make sure that these are not things that are imposed on people, but that people are part of. And I know that Marianne will talk about that later. So to me, it's interesting and exciting to start that, and I hope it's the beginning of a journey. It's of course not a magic bullet. You know, having a human rights policy is not a replacement for good politics, progressive politics, good policies, but hopefully it should help frame that, improve that, and give it a sort of solid foundation that can be transformative going forward. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to hearing people's contributions, but also thank you very much for everyone who did contribute.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed, Steve. Good scene setter for the discussions today. I'll move on to our second speaker, who should need no introduction really. It's Sheila Spencer, who of course is our Secretary of Labour Housing Group. Sheila's also worked in housing for 40 years, primarily in homelessness and housing needs, including stints in housing advice, homelessness services, academia, training and consultancy. She's been an absolutely brilliant secretary since 2018, and working really hard to push housing up the political agenda together with the rest of us, and has been one of the driving forces behind this campaign to get housing recognised as a human right. So Sheila, over to you.
Thank you. Well, Steve set out really clearly why we need housing to be considered as a human right, and what it will do for us. And if you want any more information about that, I would really recommend watching the interview that I was very privileged to do with Leilani Farha, who was coming to speak at our fringe meeting at Labour Party conference in 2021. She had an emergency as the meeting was due to start, and so instead I interviewed her separately, and that interview is online from our website. And it's inspirational. She sets out why we need it, and very powerfully what so far it has meant they've been able to change or see changes coming in Canada, where it's now part of the Constitution. So we've been delighted to work with Labour Campaign for Human Rights on this. It's a great fit, and I think it really gave us something to push in very rightly in our 40th anniversary year last year. We started with a fringe meeting at Labour Connected in 2020. Leilani came to speak to that, and we had speakers talking about the urgent need for action on homelessness crisis, very powerfully how a lack of a right to housing creates and sustains homelessness. And that to me was a very fundamental point. We had the motion at conference in September last year, moved by John. So that's now part of Labour Party. I was going to say policy, but that's not right, because it doesn't translate automatically into policy. But I think all of that support from our leader, from other key figures, as Steve has mentioned, means that we are likely to get this into policy very soon. I really think we are. I think the move is there. And then we had a very powerful fringe meeting to accompany that. The pamphlet has 15 chapters, as well as a foreword written by Matthew Pennycook. He was very sad that he couldn't stay for this meeting, but he's been very supportive too. And the contributors, as has been said, include MPs, academics, very importantly, academics and lawyers looking at the feasibility of this and what it would mean, what it means in practice, how we can get it into practice. Councillors have given very passionate reasons for needing it to be done, and housing and rights activists. Just before I talk about what next, I do want to thank Simon Hilditch, who did the formatting and design. It will look similar to our publication on council home building because it's been designed by this very capable person. And what next? We're planning to have another series of launches, perhaps focusing on particular issues, the sorts of areas that Steve's talked about. And then really what we need to do is to broaden this out to get wider support from within the Labour movement, so the other socialist societies, from trade unions, broaden this out to make sure that we're encompassing the views and the ideas from the housing campaigning world. And the example in Wales is very interesting because they're further ahead than we are in Wales. And that's being steered from a campaigning body in the voluntary sector, the Chartered Institute for Housing in Wales and Shelter in Wales. But of course they have a Labour government to support them, so it's been very strongly supported by, or the idea has been strongly supported by the Labour housing minister. So far what they've been doing is looking at the feasibility. What do we need to get there, and how do we look at the stages, because this is about progressive realisation. You don't do it all blap at one point. Having done that, I think that after that we need to start looking at what would be in a bill, and how we actually get there, and maybe even broadening out the debate to involve the other political parties as well, some of whom I think will agree with us as well. So this isn't a narrow Labour Party activity. It started with us, the two organisations, and I think it needs to broaden out to encompass everybody, and that's what I hope will happen. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Sheila. Our third speaker is Dr. Coldo Kasler, who's a lecturer in the School of Law at the University of Essex and director of the Human Rights Centre Clinic. Between 2017 and 2019, he co-drafted the first bill on economic, social and cultural rights in the UK at Newcastle University while he was the policy director of the social rights NGO Just Fair. And he also holds a PhD in European and International Studies from King's College London. So great to have you here today, Coldo, and over to you.
Thanks very much, John. Thank you for the invitation, and thanks also to Steve and Sheila for all the work that they've done to make sure that we have some collective project today to present. You mentioned that I co-drafted the first bill on economic, social and cultural rights in the UK. I did it with my colleague Peter Roderick, who is here in the audience with us, and he's also one of the authors, one of the contributors, one of the chapters in the publication. I believe it is the last one. So I've been asked to reflect a little bit of the significance of the right to housing and the possible implications in the UK. And I think the first thing to say is, conceptually, it's important to remember, as you all know, since all of you are experts on housing, that house is much more than 4 bricks and a roof. A house is also is closely connected to our freedom, because as house is the space in which we develop our own personalities, and it's the space in which we develop our family relations, and it's a space when we learn to be free and to be able to contribute meaningfully to society and to community. As Steve was saying earlier, the right to housing is recognized in international human rights law, in a number of international treaties. that the UK has voluntarily ratified in exercise of its national sovereignty. And in fact, most countries in the world have done so too, have also recognized that housing is a human right, just like the prohibition of torture is a human right, just like freedom of expression is a human right. Housing is also a human right, no more, no less important, equally important than the others. However, unlike many other countries, the UK has not incorporated these rights into UK law. So it is recognized in international law, but then when it comes to domestic law, which is really at the end of the day, the sort of law that really matters, really the UK has not brought it home just yet. And unlike many other countries, actually, and there's a growing number of countries that have recognized the right to housing in their constitutions and in their most important laws. But the UK so far has not done so. That's why this campaign is so important, because it's trying to change something fundamentally. It's trying to get the UK to comply with the highest standards of international law, to be really a country that sets a high standard of what is adequate in a society, what is a fair society. And that's why this campaign is so important. And the right to housing really is the right to adequate housing, and we shouldn't miss this. It's not just the rights to shelter. It is not rights to a roof and 4 walls around us. Is a right to an adequate form of housing. And that includes certain elements that will make a big difference in UK law and policy. It will require legal security of tenure, and that means getting rid of Section 21 of the Housing Act. That means empowering tenants in their relationship with landlords. Most countries in Europe recognize some sort of proportionality assessment of evictions. England really is an outlier, not the UK as such, but England really with the Housing Act is really an outlier in this regard compared with other countries. It also requires making sure that housing is affordable for people who cannot pay rent or have access in the private market, and that must mean in the UK context that local housing allowance must preserve at least, or must target at least the 30th percentile of local rents. That's a consequence, in my view, of the principle of affordability, which is one of the requirements of adequate housing. And it also requires that the house has to be habitable. It has to meet certain standards of habitability, and that requires ensuring that tenants have access to housing and have certain expectations for landlords to comply, to ensure that there is protection from dampness, from cold, adequate insulation, and so on. That's an element, that's in order to be consistent with the requirement of habitability, which makes housing adequate. The idea of right to housing as a social right, as Sheila was mentioning it earlier, means that public authorities should make use of the maximum of available resources progressively. And this is important because it creates the burden of proof on public authorities. Because we are recognizing that this is a human right, and because public authorities are required to put the maximum of available resources to progressively satisfy these rights, it is the state, it is the public authorities, the ones that will have to prove that actually they are mobilizing the maximum of available resources. We will do our best as researchers, as campaigners, as NGOs and civil society, as journalists, but it is really the state, the one that has to prove that it is actually mobilizing all the maximum available resources, and that includes taxes, by the way. Now, it's true that in the last, in the 2010s, with austerity, it created a huge difficulty for local authorities to implement the right to housing within their means. And those of you with experience in local authorities know this better than I do. But it is also true that there are good examples out there in the UK context of local authorities that, despite the odds and despite all the difficulties, have done their best to mobilize their available resources. And in my chapter, I talk of the case study of Newcastle, about which I wrote a report last year, and also there is a chapter in this collective volume written by Nick Forbes and Neil Monslow from Newcastle City Council. Finally, the right to housing is not really about taking power away from people and giving it to judges. Enshrining the right to housing in the law is actually an exercise of democratic control and democratic sovereignty. And that's why a campaign on the right to housing is so powerful, because it's about mobilizing society, mobilizing the Labour Party, but also mobilizing society to demand one key element of what makes society free and fair. And that's actually key, because it's a moment to reflect about what we think society should look like, what a free and fair society should look like. And that's what democracy is all about, in my view. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cole. Some really important points there for us to consider and think about it in terms of making this a real meaningful reality for people. Our final speaker is Marianne Hood, who has worked with and for tenants groups across England for over 35 years. Marianne's actually a founder member and a former chair of Labour Housing Group, and of course founding director of the Tenant Participation Advisory Service for England. She's pioneered many aspects of tenant involvement and helped to set up and was a member of the board of the Independent Housing Ombudsman Service as well. She's also chaired the National Housing Forum and the Labour government's advisory panel for the Beacon scheme. So great to have you here today, Marianne, and over to you.
Right, thanks, Joe, and it's lovely to see so many people after so long. I want to pick up the key issue really that Caldo raised, the fact that this right isn't just about having a shelter or a roof over your head. It's actually about having somewhere that's a home for you, whoever you are, wherever you are, regardless of ability or particular circumstances. And I do think that at the moment here in the UK, this must seem like a pipe dream for many people. How many times have you heard private tenants talking about their fear of being removed from their home, of being forced to live in unsafe, unsuitable conditions over which they have no choice? And sadly, how many times have you heard social housing tenants talking about the place you put me in? Absolute indictment of where we've got to. The UN Special Rapporteur on Housing said that participation is central to human rights-based strategies because it challenges exclusion and silencing. Sadly, housing policies and strategies set by government and housing bodies, if they're set from their perspective to meet their needs and their priorities, all too often they fail to provide what's needed by those on the receiving end. And I was thinking about the discussion about standards earlier in the meeting. And sadly, renting as a tenure has become increasingly insecure. Tenants have often marginalised, little opportunity to influence decision, little opportunity for their voices to be heard. And they get excluded from policy making. And the poorest and most marginalised are the very ones who are least likely to have their voices heard, least likely to be able to enforce what rights they have. And there are some rights, but sadly, tenants often don't know the extent of those rights, or even if they do and they know that their rights are being violated, they have little chance to be able to actually do anything about it. And rights to participate are now few and far between, thanks to the changes made by the Tories since 2010. Rights to be consulted, to get involved, to participate, mostly set out in regulations, not law. And as we now know, that means that they can be easily scrapped, overturned, as we saw with the scrapping of the Tenant Services Authority and Tenants Compacts and the National Tenants Voice, the very body being set up under Labour to give a voice to tenants. But there's another good reason for having participation as a right, and that's the wealth of evidence of the benefits of having tenants involved. Evidence from Joseph Rowntree Foundation, from the Audit Commission, from the Beacon scheme that I chaired until 2010. It's about making sure that people are involved not as passive consumers, but as active citizens with genuine power to be able to influence the decisions that affect them where they live. The evidence shows that if that can be done, you get much better services, more cost-effective services, better use of scarce resources, and much better planning and design decisions. However, the challenge is to make sure that everyone, whatever their circumstances, is able to have a chance to become involved. I would argue that in order to make sure that people have the right to live in, peace, security and dignity, you have absolutely got to define everything from that perspective in order to make sure that particular needs, such as people with disabilities, women, people of different ages, different backgrounds, that they will all be able to be involved in the decisions that affect them. If it's limited to those with the loudest voices and the sharpest elbows, I think that means participation becomes meaningless. So in order to make sure that it will be a genuine right for everybody, whoever they are, I think this means ensuring, first of all, that you've got access to good quality information and support so that all tenants can get involved, and prospective tenants, and that they understand the possibilities and the choices in order to be able to participate fully. I think if it's going to work effectively, it's got to be underpinned by real security of tenure. And I know that's been said by a few other people. What's the point of speaking up and getting involved if that might cost you your home, or if you're continually looking for somewhere else to live because you're on such short tenancies? And if it's going to work effectively, it must cover the whole process of setting housing policies and strategies, monitoring, reviewing and enforcing performance standards. And we've got to have effective remedies and redress to make sure that rights can be upheld. So I want to end by arguing that for participation to be an integral part of human rights strategy for housing, these clear rights must be set out in law. First of all, security of tenure to underpin participation, with equal rights for all occupiers and prospective occupiers to be involved from start to finish, to participate in the development, implementation and review of housing policies and strategies, and that has absolutely got to include financial matters. It's going to require rights to support, with tailored support to help those who are vulnerable and often marginalised, including homeless people. And there must be rights of access to resources, including provision of accessible information and training. And there's got to be rights of recognition for tenants and residents organisations, with rights to individual and collective action over poor or failed performance, with effective remedies and redress, so that rights to participation can be upheld. I think if we can get these rights put into law, we'd be well on the way to ensuring that everyone is able to realise that human right to a safe, secure home where they can live in peace and dignity.
Thank you very much indeed, Marianne. And indeed, thank you to all of our speakers. And I can see there's people doing some virtual applause there as well for you all. Some really powerful and important contributions. So thank you all. There's now the opportunity for a bit of a question and answer session. So could I ask you to raise your virtual hands if you'd like to come in and ask a question? Scott's raising a real hand there, so I will go to Scott first, as I've spotted him first up. You're on mute, Scott.
Now, I cannot raise my electronic hand. I've got no facility to do that.
That's fine. I spotted your real one, so over to you.
Participation, which I usually be able to do. Right. Would you agree for housing to really be a human right to be implemented? We have got to have enough council housing for everybody to live there as their home, who wants to. This is also being addressed on the private sector housing. We have got to abolish the sections of the 1988 Housing Act, which means that all tenants only can rent their flat for 6 months or a year. We have got to control rents so they are affordable or for people to be living. Everybody has a right to live in a secure home for as long as they want to, and a home which is large enough for their family needs. And that means controlling rent, private sector rents, and it means a massive increase in council housing. Otherwise, it is useless. Okay.
Thanks, Scott. I'll take Maureen's question as well and then come back to the panel. So, Maureen.
Hi. Yeah, I'm just one aspect I feel isn't always emphasised enough. I'm a retired occupational therapist. I worked in NHS and social services, and I can quite understand how now one of our biggest health problems is getting people out of hospital and home when they aren't well enough to manage in their homes. And there's a CLT in America which has as its strapline, housing is healthcare. And this whole issue of how the ageing population, I live in the area that's got the oldest population in the country, so we're acutely aware of this, that good design, secure housing is absolutely essential. And people often won't plan for that until they actually have a crisis. And there's often nowhere for them to go, as we're discovering. So that whole issue of ageing, of the health side of housing and good design, it has got to be included. I know that everything else is already, it's all human life is here, but it's an issue I would tend to stress, partly for the years I spent trying to somehow shoehorn people into very unsuitable accommodation because of out of sheer desperation.
Thanks, Maureen. Anybody else got a question at this point before I go back to the panel? Sem.
Hi everyone, thanks for your really inspiring introductions there. It was really good to hear all of that. So I wondered what your response would be to challenges around things like security of tenure and how to move the conversation along in the eyes of the public and those that might be resistant to a slightly more mature place rather than kind of arguing around supply. Particularly in the private rented sector. I mean, to my mind, there aren't really issues in the same way in the owner-occupier or social sector. Those arguments don't necessarily exist, but how do we overcome that as a movement?
Great, thanks, Sim. What I'm going to do is go to each of our speakers in turn and perhaps to reflect back on the questions and points that each of you have raised, because I think there's quite a lot in each of those questions. So perhaps I'll go back to the top first and start with Steve, if I may.
Yeah, sure, thanks. And just to say, I mean, those are all great points and questions. And you know, some of them there, it's really worth reading some of the chapters on. There are chapters on social housing that Steve Hilditch is. I'm not sure if Steve is on the call. If he is, then it'd be great to hear from him to directly answer that as well as the author of the piece. And of course, it was Sam who wrote the piece on rent controls, and would be, you know, could maybe say a few words on that as well. But you know, certainly those are the types of interventions in the report is suggested are needed to realise in practice the human right to adequate housing. You know, technically there are many different ways you could achieve or realise a right. There could be different types of policies and different types of interventions to achieve that goal. But I think what we can see is that there are very, very strong reasons and lots of evidence from lots of groups, political and non-political, around the need to hugely invest in affordable housing, act on security of tenure, and in certain contexts, in certain ways, to use rent controls as a possible way of dealing with that. And I think the point about, I don't have a particular comment on the point about the ageing, but other than to say it's a really important point, and one of the strengths of a human rights framework should be able to identify the needs of specific groups who need specific support, and there's a chapter on disabled people that Sheila actually co-authored, that talks about the lack of adapted housing for all sorts of needs, and it's clear that we need to be forced to look at those the different housing needs for different types of people. I don't necessarily answer to Sam's point direct. I can have a guess. I think a lot of the point about security of tenure is about trying to get people to talk less about housing as a thing and to think about it as a home, that everyone needs stability for their family. And I think that as a sentiment really is what people would relate to and engage with. And I think there's a lot of public sentiment with people who are living in rented housing and unstable settings, and there's not a lot of empathy with or sympathy for landlords who put them in that position. So I think there's fertile ground there. I don't have a more intelligent answer than that, but yeah, that feels instinctively so.
Thanks, Steve. If I could go to Sheila next for some comment and reflection on those questions. You on mute, Sheila.
In answer to Scott, it really, all of those points are absolutely essential, and building the argument for housing to be a human right in England has to build on top of our other policies, like mass building of council housing, not just abolishing Section 21, but moving to no longer having assured short hold tenancies, which is what that implies, and that is policy of Labour Housing Group that got into Labour Party's composite in 2019, was abolishing the short hold tenure. So going back to having protected tenancies as we used to have before 1988. And the rent control argument is more complicated, but the SEMS chapter and the chapter from Mark Griffin in Scotland really argue how that can be made to work. And I think there's a lot of debate to be had, but I hope that's the direction we'll go in. I just wanted to say about accessibility, in our chapter on the human rights issues for people with disabilities, we pick up that what we should be looking at is the human rights model of disability rather than the medical model or even the social model. So in the human rights model, the approach to is that there are barriers in society that are discriminatory. The obstacles are created by society, and they're not just physical, but they're also prejudice and stigma, and of course finance. And so human rights approach to accessibility comes from a different place, and I think would include the points that Maureen's made, that we, in order to live somewhere safely, you also need to have the support that will help you to manage to live there.
Thanks, Sheila. If I can go to Coldo next.
Thank you. Starting with Scott's point earlier, yes, I think absolutely social housing is essential to satisfy the right to adequate housing, and it requires building more social housing and retaining the ones we have. In 1979, 1 in 3 houses in the UK were considered social housing. Now it's 1 in 6. So it's a decrease, it's a notable decrease over the course of 40 years or so. And one of the consequences of the principle of progressive realization that we introduced earlier is the principle of non-retrogression. So the idea that in principle, you should not go backwards, you should not take steps backwards. Obviously, decreasing the amount of social housing from 1/3 to 1/6 is in principle a retrogression, and we will need to see whether the government is actually compensating that loss with other measures to ensure that we all enjoy the right to adequate housing the same way. We know that is not the case, and one of the reasons why it's not the case is because we have no means to claim the right to housing in the law and in policy. So yes, definitely, council housing and social housing is essential. About Maureen's reflection, I think you are absolutely right. Housing and health are closely interdependent, and it shows how all rights really are interdependent. You cannot really pick pick and choose. And it's also a reminder of how our health outcomes are socially determined. It's not simply about accessing medicines or accessing the NHS. It's also about the social conditions that make our health better or worse. And housing is one of those social conditions. And about Sam's point, I was looking for a reference, a toolkit that I haven't been able to find, but I will keep trying. I will keep trying. There are interesting contributions about how to communicate social rights, particularly produced by Frameworks Institute in the US, but also here in the UK. NEON and New Economics Foundation have been working on this, on how to communicate these issues better. And lessons from strategic framing and strategic communications. One of the lessons that I draw from all this literature, there is a lot of it. One of the lessons I draw is that it's important to convey not so much the importance of having access to something, but being able to do something thanks to the possibility of having access to such things. So, but in order to persuade people that people should have, or persuade the public that people should have the security of tenure, is not so much about insisting on the idea of having access to security of tenure, but about showing what individuals who have security of tenure will be able to do thanks to security of tenure, how free they will be, how their lives are going to be different thanks to security of tenure. And that idea of ability to control your life, of being free, seems to be more persuasive with the target audience than insisting on the message of having access to an asset. And that seems to be the case in relation to a number of social rights issues.
Thanks, Coldo. And if I could just go to Marianne as well for some reflections on those questions.
Yeah, I mean, I want to argue that actually, if you are able to ensure that you are being properly involved, a lot of those problem dominoes go down. The evidence is there. What happens? I mean, it's Coldo's point. What impact can having this right have? Well, let's just have a look at the evidence where tenants and prospective tenants, and I think that's really important, because I think of some of the brilliant housing schemes I saw where the people who were involved weren't yet actually the tenants, but they were the people in the community who desperately needed good quality homes, and they were fully involved in how that could be done. And it required a lot of upfront input. It required support, information, assistance, so that they could understand the practical challenges. But the results that the choices they made and the results that they came up with for the development of that housing meant that it was incredibly cost effective. It met needs about security. It met one of the impacts was those people were then playing a full role in their community and helping others. And I was really saddened when, I mean, it's a long time ago now, but I was asked to go and talk to the Advanced School for Architects, and I discovered that actually none of them had been trained in what a home should be about. They could actually become an architect without ever having to think, what is the purpose of a home and how does it work? And that's just utterly astounding. So if we can make sure that the people who are going to be living in these homes, the people who need good quality homes, are actually shaping what that's about, and including people with a range of different needs. I mean, it's just frustrating. I can go back to loads and loads of studies that show what you can do if you genuinely find ways to engage people with a range of different abilities, disabilities, coming up with really clever ways of solving the problem. Well, of course they can. It's them who do the living, it's them who do the experiencing. And so if that's excluded, not only do you leave people who tend to be excluded, more excluded, you lose out on all that potential for having really cost-effective solutions. And I'm not going to say any more about security of tenure, because I still can't forgive our party, Jackie, for not getting our single form of tenancy through when it should have done, and maybe the picture that we're faced with today would have been very different.
Thanks, Marianne. I think we've got one more question, which I'm proposing to take before we bring things to a close, and that's from Jane Strether. So, Jane.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody, and thanks for the contributions. Really excellent. And I look forward to reading the report. And I particularly like the fact that, what I've heard today is that the model that's being developed is comprehensive. But because it is comprehensive, I think that adds to the complexity for implementation. And I'm interested, I suppose, about process, about how we go from where we are now. What is there a pathway in terms of actually getting to get this policy adopted and to legislation? And is it going to be enforceable?
Thanks, Jane. Good question. I'll take a quick response from each of our panelists, and I'll go in reverse order this time. So, Fred, that's back to you first, Marianne.
Gosh, I mean, it's got to be enforceable, but I think Caldo in particular has spelt out the framework for ensuring this is enforceable. I think that's the benefit of saying this is pitched within the framework of human rights. That's what it's about. So if you've signed up to agreeing to human rights, hello, you've got to find a way to put this into practice.
I think Caldo, you've just been teed up for that one there, so I'll go to you next.
Yeah, I mean, the question of process, I will leave it to you, who are all of you who are parts of the Labour Party, because after all, it's I trust you guys will ensure that the party puts this high up in the agenda and that you succeed at that. In terms of what it'll look like at the end, I suppose there are two possible theoretical models. One model could be something that looks like a human rights act, but in relation to social rights issues, so housing being one of them, but health, education, social security, and the others. That's one model where you provide some sort of umbrella for all social rights issues. That's one option. Another option will be going topic by topic, and here my colleague Peter Roderick is an expert on these distinctions, and hopefully one day you'll have the chance to hear from him. But the more vertical way will be the one in which you go topic by topic, and you pick the right to food, for example, and you develop laws and policies that are consistent with the definition of the right to food, or likewise with the right to housing. The advantage is that it's more relatable and understandable by the wider public. You're not talking of social rights, you're talking of housing, which everyone more or less has an idea what it is. The disadvantage is that you may achieve a victory in relation to one right, but then what happens with other rights that you are leaving behind? And as we said earlier, all rights are interdependent. So it's pros and cons, and I leave the strategy to you.
Thanks, Caldo. I'll go to Sheila for a quick word on this as well.
Yes, I'm quite exercised about process, because there's no good having these aspirations and then not being able to get them put into practice. So we've talked a bit about this so far in Labour Housing Group Executive. I put a paper up a few months ago about what the process might look like, and I mentioned some of that before. So, but I think we would be very happy for people to chip in, for members to say, how about looking at it this way? How about involving these people? And we definitely need LHG members as a very first starting point to help us to broaden out. A big thing, and Jane, I know that this will apply to you as to many others, is that you will be involved in lots of other networks who we can bring in. The health one, I think, being perhaps one of the first ones that was mentioned earlier. But for Jane, child poverty, how can people have a decent life if they haven't got housing as well as a good income? So please help us, everybody, to do this and use your networks. We have speakers from LHG. I think what we need to do is develop a list of speakers who will talk about the housing as a right as a human right, as well as other aspects of Labour Housing Group work. So we would like, I think, to get speakers into all sorts of groups and campaigns to broaden this message.
Thanks, Sheila. And I'll take a final word from Steve.
Yeah, thanks. It's a really good question and point, because to be meaningful, it has to be enforceable. Human rights have to have teeth. If it's not just going to be used as rhetorical language, which unfortunately often it is, and that sometimes betrays a lack of understanding of what it means. Sometimes it understands a very good understanding of what it means, but a lack of willingness to take the actions necessary. And I think I said there are different, Calder said, to do it. There's a couple of good articles in the report, one from Peter, who's on the call, about looking at different models and different principles. There's another piece from Giles Peaker and Liz Davis on some of the issues around remedies there as well. You know, but what I personally think would be quite helpful to go ahead, I think it'd be great to have a discussion with some of these different views on how to take this forward. Also learning from Wales, learning from Scotland, as Sheila said before. There are experiences elsewhere in Canada and other places. Each has its pros and its cons and its different, you know, suitability to the different legal and political context of the country. But there are models and options out there. And I personally really like the idea of trying to get people together to put forward a model bill, you know, to see what it might look like if we try to do it. You know, I think it feels like there's an open door in terms of the policymakers within the party. I'm not necessarily sure they know exactly what it means. And the more that we can be propositional, the more that we that we can help them develop that, essentially. Because I think the concept and the idea and the language people are very amenable to, and I think it's about trying to take that a little bit further. And you know, but there's a good basis to start from, and some really good people that we can try and connect together to develop that a little bit more.
Thanks, Steve, and thanks to all of our panel. This has been a really stimulating discussion about an incredibly important issue, and you know, absolutely core to what we're trying to achieve, I think, as a Labour movement and a Labour Party. I'm going to bring proceedings to a close now, because I'm conscious we had a very long morning, and I just want to put a little bit of a break in before we go back into our last piece of AGM business. But again, a huge thanks to our panel, and also to everybody who's been responsible for pulling this report together. And I really urge everybody to take some time to read through it and share it amongst your own networks inside the Labour Party, and indeed wider as well. There's a link to the report in the chat to this meeting. There will be hard copies available in due course. If you just keep an eye on our website, labourhousing.org, for details of how you can get hold of those when they're available. And of course, we're also sharing this through our Facebook and Twitter feeds as well. I've noted Barbara's comments about the amount of time that we've been in front of a screen this morning. I think you're absolutely right. So I'm proposing that we take a short break now and reconvene